I am interested in the long-term project of taking power from taking power from the people within the Democratic Party who are pro-war and wielding it in the service of people who are anti-war. I'm very acutely aware of just how badly the pro-war side wants to make sure that someone like me and people like me and organizers like those organizers uncommitted can be nowhere near those rooms where the decisions are being made. And our message to them is we're not going anywhere.
Will Kamala Harris defeat Donald Trump in November? And can she do it without resolving the war in Gaza? Well, that could come down to a bunch of key swing states, including Michigan, home to 150,000 Arab American voters. Voters who are outraged by Kamala Harris's continued commitment to arming Israel's war. But this is a community that has never really had political influence in Washington. That is, until today. Welcome to the Big Picture podcast. My name is Mohamed Hassan, and we are joined by the founder of the Uncommitted National Movement, Abbas Alawieh. Alawieh may come from an activist background, but he's also a political insider. In 2021, he became Chief of Staff for Missouri Congresswoman Cori Bush. But after October 7, he helped start a movement to withhold a vote for Joe Biden at the Democratic primary in Michigan over his stance on Gaza. That resulted in over 100,000 people voting uncommitted on their ballot papers, and that started a national movement. And Alawieh became a delegate representing the movement, traveling to Chicago in August for the Democratic National Convention, hoping to get the attention of the new candidate, Kamala Harris. But what they thought would be a space for the Palestinian issue to be heard instead became a hostile environment, where they were accused by other Democrats of sowing division and helping Trump get closer to power. Then a week later, Kamala Harris made her stance on Israel crystal clear.
Let me be very clear. I'm unequivocal and unwavering in my commitment to Israel's defense and its ability to defend itself. And that's not going to change.
But no change in policy in terms of arms and so forth.
No, we have to get a deal done.
In 2016, Trump became president partly by overturning states like Michigan, where he beat Hillary Clinton by a margin of just 10,000 votes. 4 years later, Biden defeated him in Michigan by 154,000 votes. That means for both candidates, securing the Arab American vote could be crucial. But that relies on this community being able to vote as a bloc and recognizing the influence that they can have. So, will they do it? Or will they continue to be ignored? Abbas Alawieh, thank you very much for being with us today. Welcome to the Big Picture.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here.
So I want to begin by asking you about your career in politics. You're somebody that's not new to the political arena. You're not new to the Democrats as well. What brought you into politics in the beginning?
So I, grew up as a kid in this country. Immigrated from Lebanon when I was 6, and my entire life, my dad would take my sister and I to political event after political event, mostly local politics, taking us to the polls, making sure that we stayed engaged, talked about the importance of voting. But I never really felt like I could engage in national politics in particular, specifically because, again, I was an immigrant kid. We came here when I was 6, and I had a dream of going back and living with my grandmother, who lives in South Lebanon still. And my grandmother would always tell me, I want you to come back and live with me. I want you to come back and live with me. And to me, even though I was super interested in national politics, I was an activist on my college campus for Palestine and other issues. I always felt like getting involved in national politics was sort of admitting that maybe I couldn't go back and live with my grandmother. Then after Trump got elected, well after he got elected, maybe sometime in 2017, my grandmother called me and she said, Abbas, I'm watching this orange guy on my TV saying all kinds of really ridiculous things. Sounds like they need help over there in America. You should probably just stay there and do politics there. I know your family's always been engaged in politics. You should do that. And so to me, it was like a permission that she gave my 6-year-old self to just be there and engage in the ways that you can. And that coincided with an opportunity to meet someone who was running for Congress. His name was Andy Levin, and he was running on a progressive policy agenda that I resonated with: healthcare for everyone, housing justice, protecting unions and the right to organize. These were all things that I deeply cared about. And so that's actually how I got involved in national politics, was volunteering on a Michigan congressional campaign. And when the candidate won, I joined the same day that Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Congresswoman Ilhan Omar had their first day in the United States Congress. That was my first day, but I was a congressional staffer trying to figure out how the heck they let me in there and how I could make the most of my time there.
Yeah. And in that answer, there's something that I resonate with as well. The idea of being an immigrant when I was a kid. I moved from Egypt to New Zealand, and there was always this thing inside me that I needed to go back. I belonged in Egypt, and it took me a while to kind of figure out that no, I actually had a sense of belonging to the country that I'd migrated to, but also a sense of responsibility. I'm wondering, once you actually got into politics, once you saw that other side of the coin, how did that make you feel about being an American?
So, I mean, I went into it was the 116th United States Congress, and I was wide-eyed and was so excited to learn everything that I could about how the process worked. And very clearly, I came to learn a couple of things. One thing that I knew for sure, that an institution like the United States Congress and our institutions of government here in the United States in particular is an institution that is capable of enormous good, enormous good. I mean, helping people make ends meet, helping people who are facing catastrophe, financial or medical or otherwise. There is enormous good that comes from the United States Congress. That was clear to me before going into work there. And it was clear to me, as I was meeting people working on how to make healthcare or education more affordable, et cetera. What was also clear to me was this, very big contradiction that I felt, because every once in a while, and it wasn't just every once in a while, it happened actually very often, there would be these bills for sending more money to the Israeli military in particular. And every year there would be the bills for sending more money to the U.S. military, or giving more money to the U.S. military. It was always not just like a little bit more money, but a whole lot more money. The U.S. military would often request, through they would make a request of Congress of, hey, this is how much money we would like, and Congress would respond and say, no, we're going to give you more money than you even asked for. Mm-hmm. And so it was this strange experience for me as both an Arab and an American, to go to work in a place that, unfortunately, and this is the unfortunate reality, makes policy out of harming and in some cases killing people like me. And that was a very difficult reality to sit with, because I know this place as a place capable of great good, but also as a place with very clearly white supremacist roots. I mean, the United States Capitol building itself was built by enslaved Black people in this country, right? And so I know that the history of this place as a place that's capable of doing a lot of harm was clear, and I ran into that as someone who was just pointing out what was clear to me, that hey, it seems like a lot of leaders in our party and our government support the policy that means that a bunch of people that I care about, my own family members, end up being on the receiving end of U.S. weapons dropping. Can we change that policy? And frequently I would run into, this contradiction of, no, that's the policy as it stands in the United States government, that's supported by both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, not everyone in the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, virtually everyone in the Republican Party. I mean, in terms of its federal leaders, and here we are in 2024, not a single federal elected official on the Republican side has come out for a ceasefire, let alone any other, stopping of the weapons. Thankfully, we have a lot of leaders in the Democratic Party that have, but that's thanks to our movement and our growing movement. And so, yeah, it was hard. It felt really, really hard, and it continues to feel hard.
And you came in, as you mentioned, with this progressive wave that had come in, off the back of Bernie Sanders, and you suddenly, for the first time in American politics, you had voices in Congress that were talking about Palestine and Black Lives Matter and police brutality and all of these issues that were being heard for the very first time. Was there a feeling inside of Congress, inside the Democratic Party, that the kind of change that you had been fighting for, that you were driven by, was now possible within the establishment?
It's a great question. I mean, if you would have asked me when I was a college student, organizing walkouts and sit-ins and die-ins in the center of our campus, if you would have asked me, hey, there would be a member of Congress who's Palestinian American, or a member of Congress who comes from the movement working to save Black lives, someone like Rashida Tlaib, someone like Cori Bush, that they're going to be in Congress and that they're going to have people working for them that believe, like we do, that we shouldn't be funding endless wars and we shouldn't be treating the environment in the way that we treat it, et cetera. I would have told you that's not possible. I could not have even seen myself in those halls, because that's, the demographics of folks who get in there is very different than, me. We're not sitting next to each other right now, Mohammed, but if we were in person, you'd see, I got to give this disclaimer when I'm on Zoom with people. I'm 6'6", okay? I'm one of the largest Arabs, Muslims you will ever see in your life.
MashaAllah.
So there's something of like sticking out like a sore thumb, right?
Yeah.
But back then when I was a college student, I could not have imagined that there would be people who share our values, who speak up unflinchingly for Palestinian human rights, represented inside the United States Congress. And so certainly with the arrival of leaders like Congresswoman Presley, Congressman Omar, Congressman Tlaib, Congressman Ocasio-Cortez, and others, Congressman Levin, there was a feeling that, hey, we haven't been here. People who believe like us that every Palestinian life and every Israeli life and every person's life period is should be valued equally. I don't think we've really been represented inside those halls fairly or adequately. And so there was certainly a feeling of hope, and I think continues to be a feeling of hope in that, hey, we're inside, we're pushing things very clearly, and there is an anti-war side in our country represented by people like Congresswoman Tlaib and Congresswoman Bush. There's also a pro-war side. They're not the majority. They're a handful of folks who have a good amount of money, who represent the interests of the weapons manufacturers in this country, who make more money off of every additional bomb that drops that kills another kid in Gaza. And so the pro-war side is kind of freaking out. They just spent more money than they ever have than has ever been spent in the history of our country on 2 congressional campaigns, on Cori Bush's and on Jamal Bowman's. That to me signals that the other side is pretty scared of the power of our movement. And our movement, thankfully, is just getting started. We're not going anywhere.
October 7th comes along, and this war in Gaza and everything that we have witnessed, and you find yourself suddenly in this position where you have one foot in and one foot out, so to speak. What made you decide that you were going to take this step to make something that wasn't necessarily going to be perceived from within the party as being something that is welcomed, that's in many cases is being seen very openly as being hostile to what the Democratic Party is trying to achieve? So
even in terms of my own personal journey, Mohammed, I was I was on the Hill for half a decade, which is a half a decade too long, and work on Capitol Hill ought to be measured in dog years, so really a few decades. And I had just left Capitol Hill in September of 2023. I wanted to get away from politics for a moment. It really takes a toll on you. And I had moved back to Michigan for a family situation. I was helping my mom with a medical situation that she was having. And then October happens, and in the few days after October 7th, I'm in shock. I'm someone who has a very unfortunate expertise. In addition to my expertise as someone who's trained in policy and politics, etc. I'm also someone who, like a lot of people in southeastern Michigan, has the experience of having survived U.S.-funded bombing myself. I was a child in Lebanon in 2006. I know what those bombs feel like. I know what they smell like. I know what the planes what the planes sound like. The ones before the fighter jets that come and drop the bombs. Like that's that post-traumatic place is where I was, after October 7th, just in shock, thinking about, the atrocities and that just took place and the atrocities to come, because the Israeli military's response was very bloody immediately, and a lot of civilians, a lot of kids were suffering immediately, and so to me, it was a few days of just catching my breath, of recentering and there's this sort of dichotomy here in American politics of domestic politics and foreign policy. And, for a lot of us in southeastern Michigan, we're not experiencing what's happening to the kids in Gaza as foreign policy. We're experiencing that in our own bodies. We're going to sleep at night thinking about it. We're dreaming about it, having nightmares about it. I mean, we see our own humanity in them. And a lot of people across our country see their own humanity in the kids in Gaza. And so for me, it was a few days of just, what are we going to do? And then it became clear that this situation was different. It was different than usual, because in my time working on Capitol Hill, oftentimes progressive politicians, progressive members of Congress in particular, whenever there would be a new wave of bombardment by the Israeli military of Gaza, whenever the Israeli military would be, shamefully mowing the lawn, as they refer to it, a whole bunch of tens of Democratic lawmakers would come out, 100 plus Democratic lawmakers would come out and say, "Oh, I called for a ceasefire. I just want it to stop," which is low-hanging fruit. Usually, you just call for the thing to stop, right? Of course, there's the larger critique of, well, you should also be working to, stop the funding of the illegal military occupation, et cetera, right? But usually everybody, not everybody, but a lot of Democratic lawmakers will call for a ceasefire. This time felt different. I was hearing from colleagues within Congress saying that even liberal organizations here in the United States were pressuring members of Congress not to say the word ceasefire. And I found that to be a very big red flag as someone who knows what it's like on the inside. And so that's when I, jumped right back into it, worked with, my old bosses, Cori Bush and Rashida Tlaib, to support their leadership as they were drafting, the Ceasefire Now resolution. And, I wasn't doing that alone. I was doing that alongside a whole bunch of activists Palestinian advocates, Jewish advocates, Black activists, et cetera, who've been working on this issue for a long time and who teamed up in the wake of October 7th to push for a ceasefire. And, we've been pushing ever since. And, I just can't believe it's still happening.
And was there an idea back then that we are in Michigan, this is a swing state, there is a strategic advantage here that we can take an advantage, essentially, can we use to try and influence this foreign policy?
In those early days, my God, it's been almost a year, of ceasefire organizing. A lot of the organizing that I was involved with myself was national organizing. It was linking up to the folks that I had been working with on this issue from Washington, D.C., right? And so, groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now on the progressive side of Jewish organizing, groups like IMEU Policy Project and other Palestinian U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, these are groups that have been doing this work for a long time. So a lot of my focus was in thinking through some of the national activism around this. It really wasn't until, January of this year, of 2024, when it became clear that as we were trying everything we could, writing into our members of Congress, calling members of Congress, doing phone banks, telling them to co-sponsor the Ceasefire Now resolution, calling into the White House, protesting, doing everything we can, the message just wasn't getting through. It felt like President Biden himself deeply believed that Netanyahu should be able to do whatever he wants. I mean, and if he doesn't believe that, that's certainly what his actions are showing, because the weapons continue to flow to Netanyahu's murderous campaign. And so by the time January came around, some folks that we'd been organizing with, looked at the situation and thought and correctly pointed out that the American media, the mainstream American media, was about to pivot away from talking about Gaza and towards what American media does during presidential election years, towards the presidential covering the presidential election. And so the idea of using the Democratic presidential primary as a way of pushing for a ceasefire, pushing for a stop to the weapons and a stop to the war, really came out of our ongoing and continued assessment of how is it that we're going to make sure that the situation in Gaza, that the genocide in Gaza is not something that just fades into the background as more and more children are killed using U.S. weapons. And so we came up with a strategy and implemented a strategy specifically focused on making sure that whoever's talking about the presidential election can't ignore this issue. And there are a few reasons for that strategy. I'll point out a couple of them. One, we were having conversations with our own community members here in Michigan who felt so deeply betrayed by President Biden's approach here that they weren't just saying, I don't want to vote for President Biden. They were saying, I never want to vote for another Democrat in my whole life. I feel so betrayed. The second is we were in touch with the fact that, like people all across the world, people all across the United States, and especially Democratic voters all across the United States, were seeing what was happening on our phones to the Palestinian people in Gaza, and just recognizing it as deeply immoral and, not to mention blatantly illegal. And so we knew that that Gaza was a top policy issue and is a top policy issue, not just for Arabs and Muslims, but for a whole lot of people who are seeing their own humanity in the humanity of Palestinians. And so this is a moment when the ground is clearly shifting. And so we came up with a strategy to be responsive to that.
In that period that you're talking about, back in January, I remember there was a lot of talk about how Gaza and Biden's Gaza policy in particular is such a problem for the Democrats that this could be an issue that sinks his presidency completely. And this was, again, not just about the Arab or Muslim American vote, but this was about the youth vote, which the Democrats rely so heavily on. It has been some time since that moment, and obviously there's a new candidate, and Biden is not in the firing line in the same way anymore. Do you think this is still an issue that has an influence over the election, or has the election cycle kind of moved on from it?
Yeah, I mean, my sense in talking to people here in Michigan is that this issue is not going away. That this is an issue that more and more, especially Democratic voters, but people in general, are paying very close attention to, because the contradiction is very clear, and it's it's just like in the everyday voter's face. You have a candidate in Vice President Harris, and you have a president in President Biden who is saying ceasefire out of one side of their mouth, and with both hands as they're saying it, sending more and more fire. I mean, it's the contradiction is glaring. And so my sense is that this issue isn't going away. My sense is, as someone who was among the leaders here in Michigan, alongside folks like Layla Al-Abed and Lexi Zaidan here in Michigan, was among the folks who mobilized voters. We did 1.5 million voter contacts in 3 short weeks here in Michigan and earned 101,000 votes in a state where, and that was in the Democratic presidential primary. The last time Trump won in this state, he won by 10,700 votes. And so we were saying, hey, these are 101,000 voters who are self-identifying, saying Gaza is a top policy issue for me. And again, to be clear, these are not just Arab and Muslim voters. In fact, the minority of them are. We earned over 10% of the vote for Uncommitted, which we made clear was a vote for peace, against war, and for Palestinian human rights, in 75 out of 85 counties here in Michigan. And most of those counties, if I would walk in, I would probably increase the percentage of Arabs and Muslims by 100%. Okay, so like this wasn't, Arab and Muslim strongholds. This is a message that resonated. And so, unfortunately, I don't believe the Democratic Party leadership's response has really contended with the seriousness of this issue and with the pain that people are experiencing. And I am very concerned that it will have electoral consequences.
So last month you traveled to Chicago to attend the DNC, representing the Uncommitted Movement. What happened? What kind of reception did you receive when you arrived?
We did our campaign in Michigan. We earned 101,000 votes. The campaign spread like wildfire across the country, where local organizers in states like Wisconsin and Minnesota and Washington State and Missouri and Hawaii and elsewhere ran their own uncommitted campaigns. From Michigan, we tried to be as helpful as we could, but this was an idea that people caught onto. And so over 740,000 voters nationally voted uncommitted as a pro-peace, anti-war vote. There are more voters than that who, in their state didn't have an uncommitted option. So did things like they left the ballot blank or they wrote in ceasefire or other things. And so by the time we got to the Democratic National Convention, as a result of this movement, we had earned 30 uncommitted delegates, right, who were going to the Democratic National Convention. Now, in the grand scheme of things, there was something like 4,000 Harris delegates. So we knew that we were outnumbered, but 30 delegates who organized together, thanks to the leadership of Layla Al-Abed in particular, organized together for months, trying to get on the same page about what it is that we wanted. So we went in with very clear policy asks of Vice President Harris. We want a stop to the weapons that are being used to kill civilians. It's deeply immoral and deeply illegal according to international humanitarian law and according to U.S. law. And we want a ceasefire, and the way to achieve a ceasefire is stop sending the fire. It felt clear to us. So we went in with an organizing plan. We said, we're going in, these are our two policy demands. We're going to reiterate those policy demands. Our obligation to the people who elected us is to make sure that this pro-Palestinian human rights message is heard at the Democratic National Convention. And so that meant to us engaging in the media as much as possible, hosting daily press conferences, not just with people who were uncommitted, but with a whole bunch of folks who've endorsed Vice President Harris, who also agree that she needs to stop sending weapons. But also we were there to engage with those Harris delegates and say, hey, these are the policy demands that we're here to represent, and they're supported by the vast majority of Democratic voters. Will you join us and become a quote-unquote ceasefire delegate? So we came in as 30 uncommitted delegates. We left the Democratic National Convention with over 300 delegates who had signed up to become ceasefire delegates. So our movement is clearly popular and growing. We also went in, our primary asks are our policy asks, stop sending weapons so that we can get a ceasefire. And we went in with some secondary asks of the Democratic National Convention. Those asks included, space for us to be able to host some press conferences, to do our work, so that we can host a vigil that could be officially sponsored by the Democratic Party that honors the lives of everyone who's been killed, not just Israelis, because in the past, the Democratic Party had only agreed to sponsor vigils that were commemorating Israeli people who've been killed. And so it was important to get that recognition of Palestinians for us as Democrats. And we had asks that related to the DNC programming in particular. One, we wanted an official discussion of Democrats organizing for Palestinian human rights, something that could be sponsored by the Democratic Party. And we got that in an historic panel, the first of its kind. The Democratic Party and the DNC in particular sponsored a discussion that was facilitated by Attorney General Keith Ellison and Jim Zogby, and featured a couple of Palestinian leaders, Layla Al-Abed and Hala Hijazi. Hala, of course, has family in Gaza, as well as Congressman Andy Levin and Dr. Tanya Hassan, who's a U.S. medical doctor who has spent time in Gaza. That was a really important discussion. It was a packed room. It was the first time anything like that had ever happened. Again, it wasn't why we went to the DNC, but it was one of the things we were asking for. Another ask that we had, which was a secondary ask, was we had a couple of asks, and we had a couple of requests for speaking time from the main stage at the DNC. So that's where the party features all of the issues that really matter to Democratic voters. And so, advocates against gun violence and advocates for reproductive justice and for, expanded abortion care, advocates for racial justice. I mean, you name it, the party will feature speakers from the main stage, the stage that ultimately the vice presidential candidate and the presidential candidate speak from. And so we wanted to make sure that Gaza was discussed on the stage. And so we asked for Dr. Tanya Hassan to be a speaker. And we wanted a speaker who was affiliated with Uncommitted to speak from the stage. Now, it became clear in our negotiations with Vice President Harris's team and with the DNC that for some reason they weren't open to Dr. Tanya Hassan. I don't really understand why. We would have really benefited from hearing from her on the ground perspective, especially in a moment when journalists have not been allowed in and journalists are being killed by the Israeli military, targeted by the Israeli military. And so the testimony of doctors ends up being, they end up having to carry more of a burden than they otherwise would have. Not only are they healing people, but they're having to report back what's happening on the ground. But they weren't open to Dr. Tanya Hassan speaking, and we had heard, we were seeing media reports that an Israeli-American family would be featured from the stage. Mm-hmm. And so for us, we said, okay, the Democratic Party's platform, the draft platform, said that the party values Israeli lives and Palestinian lives equally. And so since that's the case, we updated our ask and said, well, our request is that a Palestinian American speak from the stage. We made this request weeks before the convention. We made this request via text messages and emails and in-person meetings. So the request was very known, and again, it was just a secondary request of ours. And for some reason, after a lot of negotiating, after a lot of hey, the answer isn't no yet, we're working on it. So the fact that the answer isn't no is a good sign. Don't worry, stick with this. We got a call the Wednesday of the Democratic National Convention saying that they will not agree to have a Palestinian American speak from the stage. And, it was unfortunate because, we would have been so lucky to hear from a Palestinian American speak from the stage. Palestinians in this moment and always have very important perspectives that I think American audiences need to hear from, and that certainly delegates to the Democratic National Convention would have benefited from hearing from that expertise. It was the Democratic Party's loss. It was the Democratic Party leadership's loss, because when they did that, we ran out of options institutionally. We had done everything that we could do to deliver on that specific demand. And, there was a blatant silencing, discriminatory silencing as far as I'm concerned. And so we just did what regular everyday people do when something isn't right. We sat in our power as regular everyday people. We said, we're going to sit out here. We're not going anywhere. And we want the world to know that the Democratic Party leadership is, for some reason, scared to hear from a Palestinian American. And that's deeply hypocritical for a party that claims to be the party of inclusion and equity and representation. And I think we ended up getting more attention to the fact that there's something deeply wrong with how the Democratic Party engages on the issue of Palestinian human rights than we otherwise would have gotten if they would have just let a speaker speak for 2 or 3 minutes from the stage. So I'm proud of what we did.
And what was the reception that you got from other members of the Democratic Party, other attendees, other delegates, maybe other Congress people as well that were there at the time that were obviously aware of what you were trying to do?
So for me personally, it was an interesting experience because a lot of the people that I was seeing in the hallways at the United Center where the DNC was being held were people that I've worked with for the last 5 years.
Former colleagues.
And colleagues, members of Congress who I know personally, their staff. So I was going up and having those conversations with them. And to be honest with you, most people that I had conversations with, when I would describe what it is that we're trying to get Vice President Harris to do in terms of updating her policy, and when I would describe that, her team has been engaging with us in a way that Biden's team was not, they would say, "Oh, that's really positive. I hope she continues engaging with you." And part of it to me is, since I was on the inside and I'm now on the outside in this way, I was pleading with colleagues saying, hey, I'm I'm a Democrat just like you are. We've worked on stuff together, right? I want you to know that if the policy of our party was to support sending weapons to kill your family members, then I would understand if you made advocating against that policy your number one priority. So I hope you understand that that's what I'm doing. And I would tell you that the vast majority of folks that I spoke to recognize that that is real. That's legitimate. That's what we're doing as Democrats who happen to be Arabs, who happen to be, someone like me from South Lebanon. Like I'm here. I'm working on everything that we love. Why is it that this policy gets to be the status quo? That my family members in South Lebanon have to live under these weapons and bombs that our government is sending, and what they're experiencing pales in comparison to what our siblings in Gaza are experiencing. And so generally, I would say we had a lot of productive, a lot of productive interactions, and that didn't surprise me. And I'll tell you why it didn't surprise me. It didn't surprise me because, again, the majority of Democrats don't agree with the policy that Democratic leadership is continuing to employ of sending weapons to Netanyahu, and that prevent a ceasefire. And so we saw that in the delegates that we were that we were engaging in. I had a couple of interactions where someone would hear me doing an interview or something on Palestinian human rights, and in one instance, I was stopped and I was asked, "Do you ask for the release of hostages when you're advocating for this?" And my answer, very simply and bluntly, was yes, of course. We want the release of all hostages on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. And they sort of didn't know what to do with me and walked away, But like that, beyond that, the reception was positive. I'll also say though, the convention is a big party. It's a big party where there's music and lights, and everybody's there to celebrate and dance and just have really good energy heading into a general election. And I and the other uncommitted delegates, we had a few uncommitted delegates who were Palestinian American themselves, and I can certainly speak from my own experience, was in that big arena hearing song after song and cheer after cheer, and really sitting with, the grief, the grief that certainly Arab Americans are experiencing in this country, seeing what our country is doing to Palestinians, definitely Palestinian Americans, definitely Muslim Americans, definitely voters of conscience all across our country. I was sitting with that grief and sitting with my own experience, having survived those weapons, and thinking, my God, it's like, there's this giant contradiction where all of these kids have been killed using a policy that this party fails to even grapple with. That it was really hard. It was really, really hard being in that party environment when our community is carrying so much grief. So yes, positive engagements, but also I think the Democratic Party leadership is deeply out of step with the humanity of Palestinians.
I remember when Kamala Harris was first, chosen to take the reins from Joe Biden. There was messaging from her camp that she was going to have a different stance on the issue on Gaza, that they were going to get different messaging from her, that it wasn't going to follow the line of what Joe Biden had pushed this whole time, and that he'd been obviously criticized for. And you heard her speaking at that conference for the first time as the official representative, and make it quite clear that not only did she believe in Israel's right to defend itself, but that she was also committed to giving Israel the means to defend itself, which is obviously talking about those weapons. And then days after the conference, she had that sit-down interview. She said the same thing again and essentially made it clear that her policy won't change. What does that mean for you? What does that mean for the uncommitted vote? What does that mean for what you guys have tried to do and what you have left to do from now until November?
The idea that a major party candidate does not support an arms embargo on the state of Israel is not a new idea. That's been the policy of every major party candidate for a long time. The fact that we're even talking about, oh, maybe she'll change her policy is a testament to the historic levels of organizing that we're seeing all across the country and indeed all across the world that is demanding a more humane approach, that's pointing out the hypocrisy. And so to say that, oh, Kamala Harris doesn't support, a stop to sending the weapons, that's nothing new. She hasn't before, and no presidential candidate, major party presidential candidate has before. And so that's precisely why we're organizing, because we need that to change to save lives. So, of course, it's disappointing. Not just disappointing, it's unacceptable for Vice President Harris, given where the majority of Democratic voters are, to continue to mislead Democratic voters by sort of repackaging talking points, speaking to the humanity of Palestinians, but simultaneously continuing to support the policy that's killing a whole lot of Palestinians. It's hypocritical. It's unacceptable. And for us, this movement, the movement to achieve a ceasefire, the movement to achieve not another bomb, we didn't get into this thing so that we can just focus on an election. We got into this thing because we want to save the lives of our loved ones who are living in Gaza, because the people in Gaza are not strangers to us. They are our siblings. The people in the West Bank are not strangers to us. They are our siblings. We love them. And we're not going to stop pushing for the policy to change. And so for us, we have to take stock now, before the election, during the election, and after the election, how we continue growing our movement. And, we, with the Uncommitted Movement, have been very clear. We put our cards on the table. We said, we're organizing as Democrats within the Democratic presidential primary. Vice President Harris, if you would like for the Uncommitted Movement to endorse you, we will endorse you even through our pain, even through the political critiques and risks that might come with it. We will endorse you, which to us, endorsing Vice President Harris would mean mobilizing for her election, doing the kind of thing that I talked to you about earlier, of like 1.5 million voter contacts that we did in 3 short weeks ahead of the Democratic presidential primary, that delivered the 101,000 votes in Michigan, go out into the community, have the conversations. We would do that level of organizing if you change your policy, if you agree to stop sending weapons. And if that's not what you're able to do, right, then tell us what your policy is, and let's negotiate. Tell us what you're willing to make your policy, and then we can have our conversation with our uncommitted delegates, with key stakeholders, and see if it's worth, coming to an agreement about whether or not uncommitted will endorse. I think the vice president's campaign really should pursue an uncommitted endorsement, because in a state like Michigan, we need every vote we can get, and the Democratic Party has deeply betrayed people for whom Gaza is a top policy issue. And the Uncommitted Movement has built some trust there. And we could leverage that trust to ensure that we beat Donald Trump and deliver a better policy. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that Vice President Harris is interested in that. All the indications from her campaign up until this point, it seems like they're not interested in an endorsement. So that's fine. We will have to make our endorsement decision here in the next couple of weeks. But regardless, we're staying focused on the central issue at hand, the policy for not just the last year, the policy for the last few decades has been not just genocide in the case of, since October 2023, but it's been illegal military occupation. It's been an illegal apartheid system that the United States government supports with the weapons that we're sending, that are being used illegally to harm civilians. So for us, this isn't just about between now and November. For us, this is how do we grow the movement in the United States of America that will change the political landscape and deliver and force the political will necessary to get a policy change. I don't think that's something that we can do in just a day or two, or even a month or two. I wish it were. I'm certainly, and uncommitted organizers and ceasefire organizers and folks all around the country, especially Palestinian-led advocacy organizations, have been doing this work. Right? We're not going to stop pushing, but we have to take an honest assessment of what happens next. If what would our organizing look like under a Harris presidency, under a Trump presidency, and make those assessments. So, in the next couple of weeks, Uncommitted will come out with its decision on whether or not to endorse Kamala Harris, and we'll have to, contend with what the most productive thing that we can do to ensure that we get an updated policy of not another bomb between now and the election, and well after the election. But one thing is for certain: sure, Biden is not the candidate, but Biden is the president right now. We got to keep up the pressure on him, regardless of the election, and on Vice President Harris to change the policy well before we get a new president, because we don't get a new president until, January 21st will be the first day in office. So we need the policy to change before then, because there are too many kids being killed using U.S. weapons in the meantime.
And the leverage that your organization has, particularly in a place like Michigan, is that there you have been able to successfully prove that there is a number that is difficult for the Democrats to ignore. This is a state that they need to win. And in order to win that vote, they need to work with you. And that is the kind of the wisdom that you are bringing into a space like the DNC to say that, can you really afford to lose this vote because of this particular demographic of people that care about this issue? And as you have pointed out, so far, the Harris campaign has made it clear that that is not something that they're willing to negotiate, and that this is their policy, and that policy is not going to change. And so what happens then if on November 4th that policy still hasn't changed, and there are these 100,000 votes in Michigan that could decide the election? What would you tell your voters? Would you tell them not to vote for Kamala Harris? Is that an option for you? Is that a card that you are willing to play with?
Yeah, so here's how I see it. From where I sit, okay, I have a responsibility to advancing the most humane policies possible. I also have a responsibility to my grandmother who lives in South Lebanon, to my aunts and uncles who live in South Lebanon, who are telling me, hey, Abbas, I know you're working on this thing. Do you think that they're going to stop bombing us anytime soon? So the stakes that are at play are not theoretical to me. I know just how big the stakes are. And so I, as a responsible political actor, want to have an eye towards how is it that in our country, in the United States of America, we will achieve a more humane policy on this issue. What I know for certain is that as Arab Americans, as Muslim Americans, on our own, in this country, unfortunately, we do not yet have the political power to stop an actual genocide. That is a very horrific reality that I go to sleep thinking about, okay? And not just as Arab and Muslim Americans, as anti-war voters, the pro-war side has so much power that they have enabled and are sustaining an actual genocide. So to me, the question that I'm sitting with is, how do we build enough power so that the policy changes? And the way that we build enough power so that the policy changes within the Democratic Party, okay, which is one of the two major parties that is ruling here, is we need to not be insular as a movement. We need to recognize where our movement sits alongside other movements in our country that have been pushing for justice on multiple fronts. So we need to be building, and as we've been building, and with the Uncommitted Movement, building those relationships with labor unions. More labor unions in the United States than ever before have come out for an arms embargo. But we need to be building with Black-led organizations because this is a critical election for Black voters nationwide, and they have really critical issues at play here. We need to be building with youth-led organizations. So we are not a movement that itself on its own will change the policy in this country. We are a movement that is part of a larger coalition of groups that increasingly is on our side about this. And so what I don't want, and what I think would be destructive, would be for us to go out and say, it would be okay if it were Donald Trump, because as long as it's the Democrats learn a lesson, then that will be enough. I think that would be disastrous. If Donald Trump comes, I'm studying what Donald Trump has planned for our movement, trying to save lives. Donald Trump wants to deport protesters on college campuses, not to mention brutalize them and unleash military or police force against them. Donald Trump wants to come for Donald Trump and the Republicans have specific plans for how to go after any organization in the United States that's working on Palestinian human rights and trying to take away their nonprofit status. And not just that, go after the organization that's funding them to do that work and take away their nonprofit status too. Not to mention what Donald Trump has planned for Gaza and for the West Bank. His son-in-law is fantasizing about $1 million condos on Gaza Beach. He's taking contributions from people who want the full annexation of the West Bank. So I'm sitting with all of that, and I'm sitting with my uncle calling me from South Lebanon saying, Abbas, do they know over there? Is America clear that if Donald Trump comes, that he will greenlight Netanyahu to just do whatever you want with these people? So I am not willing to take on a position that the important thing is that Democrats are punished. The reality is the only people who will be punished, not the only people, but among those who will be punished disproportionately are our own family members who live in Gaza and in the West Bank and in southern Lebanon if Donald Trump becomes president. So for me, what that leaves us with is we have to engage in the nuanced conversations with our community about what our options will be. I've asked the vice president's team as recently as today, hey, we want an update to the policy. What can we expect? We've got the next couple of weeks on the uncommitted side of things to come out with whether or not we're endorsing. But regardless of what happens, I think what this moment requires is not just this person versus that person. I think this moment requires how do we build the movement in this country to ensure that we deliver a policy change? That's not going to happen in just a month or two. That's going to require us being part of a broader coalition that does that. And so I think, based on my own analysis and based on the analysis of people way more smarter than me, like policy experts here and racial justice experts here and my uncle living in South Lebanon, I think we've got to block Donald Trump regardless. I think that's critical to growing our movement. And what that means about how people vote for Kamala Harris or not is the nuanced conversation that we need to have. But I'm hearing too many people right now say things like, I just heard someone yesterday say, I think the Democrats have left us with no choice. I'm going to vote for Trump because he's the anti-war candidate. Based on what I know about Donald Trump, I know he's not the anti-war candidate, but that's the message that the Democratic Party leadership, by abandoning this community, is allowing to spread. And so, in the absence of real leadership from the Democratic Party, we have to step up and say, regardless of how we vote, we're not voting for either Kamala or Trump because they represent how we feel on this issue. No major presidential candidate has ever represented how we feel on this issue. We have to vote not as a love letter, we have to vote as a chess move for how we continue our organizing moving forward. That's the wisdom that I carry, from fellow leaders in this movement. My friend Jennifer Knox at Working Families Party says that our vote is not a love letter; it's a chess move. We have to think seriously about not just get sidetracked with the horse race of November. We have to think about how we build the movement in our country that forces a policy change that saves lives.
But November is a particular touch point, and it's a particular opportunity for a very small community like the one that you represent, like the one that you come from in Michigan, to have an outsized influence on an election like this. And obviously, you've had your fair share of criticism of people that are saying that what you're doing is just pushing people to vote for Trump, or kind of giving Trump more oxygen in an election where he deserves less, and where we're fighting for an existential fight to save democracy. But you are also getting people that are criticizing you on the other side and saying that by not committing to a real challenge to the Democrats in November by really not putting that vote on the line and making them feel like they could really lose the election because of this. You are weakening your hand. You are essentially allowing them to do what they seem to be doing now, which is saying that we don't need to deal with this. We can afford to go on without it, and we'll be fine. Is that how you see it?
So the way that I see it is we've used the Democratic presidential primary process in a creative way that hasn't happened before, and demonstrated that there are votes here um, uh, 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 for votes of voters for whom Gaza is a top policy issue. So that is clear. And I do not think of myself as someone who is a part of a small community or represents a small community. I think of myself not just as an Arab or Muslim American. I think of myself as one of the majority of Democrats who wants a different approach on this issue. I also am someone who I do not perceive myself as someone with the luxury, given that my own family members are living in South Lebanon, of saying, well, maybe we could just try Trump and see what happens. Like, not only do I know that that would mean a lot more of our family members would be killed, I also myself was in the Capitol on January 6th. Okay. I could have been one of the people who, like, the white supremacist mob that he sent, could have harmed. Okay. Donald Trump's agenda for us is extremely dangerous. And so we have, these really difficult challenges and analyses that we have to contend with between now and November, of both saying the truth about how dangerous Donald Trump would be with our community, because I think a lot of folks don't really know, and I don't blame them. I mean, like, a lot of what my cousins will tell me will be like, "Well, Abbas, how could Trump be any different? What's worse than genocide?" Right? And I think I understand people who feel that way. I mean, that's that what we're seeing is so out of bounds. It's crossed so many lines that it's unimaginable. But we're also having to contend with that, as much as we would love to be living in a society and in a country, as much as I would be love to be living in a country where it's not this duopoly, where it's just it's either going to be a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. That's the world we live in. It's going to be a Democrat or a Republican. And so we have to take this movement, this uncommitted strategy, all the way up until the edge, right? And I think we did that through the DNC, and we're going to continue doing that for the next couple of weeks until we announce our endorsement strategy. We have to take that all the way up until the line, and then recognize that the Democratic Party, as of now, I hope they change their mind. If they're listening, you still have time to change your mind. Like, you can change the policy. But if their calculus is that they don't need voters in Michigan, for whom this is a top policy issue, and that they're going to try and get maybe some Republican voters to supplement, those votes, then that will be on them. People should be asking them, why is it that you're willing to risk Michigan in this way? And I hope that whatever calculus they're making, that they're right, that they can still beat Donald Trump even without this community. I happen to think that that's a very dangerous game to play. I wouldn't advise that they do it.
Are you worried that come November, if the situation doesn't change the way that it is now, that this would have been a missed opportunity?
It's certainly a missed opportunity for the Democratic Party, but the unfortunate reality that I live with as someone who both works within the Democratic Party and happens to be Arab and Muslim American, is that the Democratic Party's current policy is it's leading to a culture within our own country of growing anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobic sentiment, and it's perpetuating a policy that means that a whole bunch of people get killed using U.S. weapons simply because of who they are. It's unacceptable. So the party itself has, and the party leadership are perpetuating a level of not just discrimination, but violence that's totally unacceptable. And to me, yes, it's a missed opportunity for them, but I am interested in the long-term project of taking power from the people within the Democratic Party who are pro-war and wielding it in the service of people who are anti-war. Because let me tell you something. I think a lot of folks in our communities, people who are anti-war, see how badly the Democratic Party is operating right now, Democratic Party leadership is operating right now, and say, well, you should just leave the building. Stop engaging with them. They suck. Why would you even continue engaging? What I think is, I was in those halls. I'm very acutely aware of just how badly the pro-war side wants to make sure that someone like me and people like me and organizers like those organizing with Uncommitted can be nowhere near those rooms where the decisions are being made. And our message to them is, we're not going anywhere. We're going to continue growing our power within the Democratic Party, because our Democratic Party is not the one that you are the way that you're leading this Democratic Party does not align with the majority with what the majority of Democratic voters wants. And we're going to take power for regular everyday people, working with unions, working with Black-led organizations, working with youth organizations, until we have more power than they do. That's how I see it. This isn't a week or a month long project. This is a project that we have to invest in across the board, because that's how we're going to be able to deliver a policy that saves lives, and policies in general that save lives.
Finally, Abbas, you've had plenty of conversations with the Harris campaign, and you've had an opportunity to speak to her directly, from what I understand. What was the message when you had that chance to look her in the eye and to speak with her? What were you trying to communicate? What did you say?
I had the opportunity to meet Vice President Harris very briefly. I had been working with her campaign, been asking for a meeting to discuss the policy demands of our movement, stop sending the weapons, and so that we can achieve a ceasefire. As part of that engagement, the campaign invited myself and co-director of Uncommitted, Layla Al-Abed, to go and be in the photo line that welcomes Vice President Harris to Michigan. And so both Layla and I, engaged with Vice President Harris directly and asked, and what I recall saying to her was something along the lines of, my name is Abbas. I'm one of the leaders of the Uncommitted Movement. I'm also an uncommitted delegate from Michigan. We want to be able to support you here in Michigan, but we need an update to the policy that saves lives. Would you be willing to, uncommitted voters want to support you, but need an update to the policy that saves lives. Would you be willing to meet to discuss an arms embargo that saves lives? I said that to the vice president. She expressed an openness very clearly. Mm-hmm. Layla repeated that same sentiment to the vice president when she met her, and the vice president also, expressed an openness, pointed her to her staff member, and said, "Yes, we should talk." And so, what came next is, I think that there were, certain pro-Israeli military forces that were really upset about the fact that there was even discussion of an arms embargo, and so there was all of this cleanup of, oh, she doesn't support an arms embargo. We didn't say she supports an arms embargo. We know where her policy is. That's precisely why we're trying to get her to change it. But I think engagements like that, to me, speak to a couple of things. I think, for one thing, a lot of what we're hearing, and you alluded to this earlier in our conversation, a lot of what we're hearing is that Vice President Harris is different than President Biden on this issue because she feels differently. Mm. I happen to, on a personal level, I can see that. I can see that President Biden, as someone who has had the political trajectory that he had, who has, from what I can tell, a lot more Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims in his orbit, as friends or as advisors. I can see that she personally, as an individual, might feel differently about this issue than President Biden. I also know, and one of my colleagues points this out. He says, if I had $1 for every time an American politician expressed sympathy for Palestinians privately, I'd be a very rich person. Mm-hmm. I also know that that's true. That in this moment of genocide, we cannot go to our community and say, "Hey, Kamala Harris feels differently. Trust us, it'll be a little bit different." That's not acceptable. We need accountability. We need her, whatever it is that she feels. We're not dealing with just Kamala Harris, the individual. We're dealing with Kamala Harris, the person who's leading the Democratic Party now, as the candidate who very likely will be the president of the United States. We need her to say things publicly that bring the United States policy up to date with what is moral, what is just, and what is legal in this case. And that is stop sending weapons that are being used to kill civilians. It's unacceptable. Stop doing it. So that's how I feel about that interaction. I certainly felt like she was listening in a way that that felt positive, but I can both acknowledge that and recognize that listening is not enough. We need the policy to change now, not later.
And if you had another opportunity, maybe a more intimate one, to speak with her, and you've talked about, the activism that you're doing, the connection that you have with what is happening, both as an Arab American, as somebody that comes from Michigan, as somebody that has worked alongside Palestinians, but as also, as you mentioned, somebody that knows firsthand the experience of being on the receiving ends of those bombs. What would you say to her?
In February, President Biden sent a group of senior advisors to him, John Feiner, Samantha Power, Stephen Benjamin, Tom Perez, and others, and they had a series of meetings with leaders from the Arab American, Muslim American communities. And what I said to them in that moment is really how I feel. Those are folks who, I was a chief of staff on Capitol Hill, so I actually worked very closely with the president's team. I worked very closely with the vice president's team. I worked very closely with the vice president's team when she was a senator, not a president, not a vice president, right? So, like, these are people that I know. And so in that meeting, urged them. I said, I've worked with your teams. So if, I hope you can see me as a colleague. I was recently on the inside. If you do not see me as a colleague, at least I hope you see me as a human. What I am telling you is that as a human, when I was a child, I experienced the weapons, the bombs that our government is sending to kill those kids. And I'm telling you, I'm speaking on behalf of that child and a child that feels solidarity with every 15-year-old in Gaza right now, that those bombs gotta stop. Like that's just what needs to happen. I'm asking that kid, what do you most need? And that is what's needed. Stop the bombs. Not another bomb. That's what's needed. And so I looked every one of them in the eye and I asked them, because I'm an advisor myself, so I know I know a little bit about how this works. I asked each of them, have you advised the president to push for a ceasefire? This was in February, and not one of them could say yes. And I think that it signifies that up until that point, the president himself didn't have anybody around him who was advising him that, hey, we should at least be pushing for a ceasefire, or say we're pushing for a ceasefire. So, there is something to be said about, making sure that we both understand how this works, how these political leaders are being advised, but then also like continuing to build relationships with them where they cannot continue a policy that dehumanizes Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims to a level where we just get to be killed without any consequences. And so, to me, that requires continued engagement. We have to ensure that we're not going anywhere. And so, if I were to get to sit down with Vice President Harris, I would tell her about my own family members. I would tell her about the stories of the horrors that I'm hearing from community members who have family in Gaza, who've lost tens or 100 plus family members, because they, unfortunately, and I think this is evidenced by their ridiculous, stupid, discriminatory decision not to have a Palestinian American speak from the stage, but the Democratic Party leadership, unfortunately, have and the pro-war elements within the Democratic Party, unfortunately, have dehumanized Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians to a level where I think they just think of us as numbers. And we're going to continue insisting that we are here in our full humanity and we're not alone. We're actually part of a really big and growing movement in our country that's going to force you at every turn to contend with the fact that you are supporting a policy that's killing babies. That's the policy that you're supporting. And if that hurts you to hear, then you should probably change how it is that you're approaching this issue. You should probably stop supporting the policy that kills babies.
And you are fighting to continue to have a seat at the table to be able to say those things.
Of course. And I want to be clear. I think that there's, as a community, we need to be aware that we have to be at the table, and we have to be outside, and we have to be on the phones. We have to be everywhere. There is no one piece of this that is more important than the other. And let's also be clear with each other that, I did many media interviews from the inside at the DNC, and a lot of the questions that I got was, well, don't you think the protesters outside are undermining what you're doing, trying to get a seat at the table? And I think we have to be disciplined as a movement. I think we have to say, and this is how I responded every time, is I'm here because I want to change in the policy. The policy is that babies get killed using U.S. weapons, and the people who are enforcing and promoting that policy are the leaders of the Democratic Party. So the people who are preventing me from my policy goal are not the people outside saying stop sending bombs. The people who are preventing that are the party leadership, and I want to say that to their face. So I think we need to be everywhere. That's how I think we end up being strongest as a movement.
Abbas Alawieh, I really appreciate your time, and we hope we get to speak to you again before the election and catch up. But thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Mohamed. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and a big thank you to our guest today, Abbas Alawieh. We want to know what you have to say about this conversation, about the ongoing war in Gaza, and about the upcoming US election. So please leave your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, you can find all of our episodes in audio format wherever you get your podcast from. And until next time, salam.